Hi, I'm Steve French. We're here at the site of one of the most famous passenger train robberies, and not only in Civil War history, but also in American history. This is the site of Mosby's famous Greenback raid, which occurred on the early morning hours of October 14th, 1864, about 1 mile west of present Bardane, West Virginia. It was called Brown's Shop then, and just beyond Quincy Siding, positively identified in all the B&O reports of this incident.
At the close of Thursday, October 13th, at his nearby farm called Mount Pleasant, Charles Agleby wrote in his farm diary, "The day pleasant but windy. The hands finished seeding in the corn rows in the hill field, now seeding in the other in the same manner. My boys carting pumpkins out of the fields, the green ones for the hogs and the others to eat. Mr. Wrench's wagon had come for wool. We loaded it up, 31 bags weighing 851 pounds. Same by 28 3/4 yards of striped linsey, 27 yards all wool flannel. Betty and Jenny Bell up for a little while."
Late on the night of October 13th, the B&O Express West left Baltimore bound for Wheeling, West Virginia. There were about 200 passengers on board, which included 27 soldiers going back to their post in Martinsburg and Cumberland, and also about 60 German immigrants headed west. The train made real good time. It was reported past Brown's Shop at 2:30 a.m. Moments later, they crashed into the side of this railroad cut just over my right shoulder. It was complete bedlam. Shot fired into the car. However, the locomotive crashed, exploded, and killed the engineer, Elijah Collins.
Early in October, one of my best men, Jim Wiltshire, reported to me a gap through which we might reach that railroad without exciting an alarm. But I knew it would injure Sheridan to destroy a train. The western-bound passenger train was selected from the schedule as I knew it would create a greater sensation to burn it than any other. It was due about 2 o'clock in the morning. Wiltshire conducted us to a long, deep cut on the railroad. No patrol or picket was in sight.
How did Mosby get here? On October the 12th, he had started this way after receiving information from one of his scouts, Jim Wiltshire, that there was a gap in the picket lines nearby, and it would be a good opportunity to stop one of these trains and interrupt Sheridan's means of communication. Sheridan was in his army was that time camped around Middletown, Virginia, but he relied on this line to bring him supplies, bring him troops. This night, the B&O was also bringing him $173,000 to pay some of his troops.
It was a lovely night, bright and clear, with a big Jack Frost on the ground. I believe that I was the only member of my command who went through the wall without a watch, but all of my men had watches, and we knew it would not be long before the train would be due. We had ridden all day and were tired and sleepy, so we were soon peacefully dreaming. I laid my head in the lap of one of my men, Kirk Hutchinson, and fell asleep.
Mosby at this time had been injured. He'd been injured earlier that day in a fight near the Plains, Virginia, when his horse fell during the fight and rolled on him and injured his ankle. That was October 11th. But when the next day, on October the 12th, he decided to head this way, he took 84 of his men and headed from Middleburg westward towards Bunker Hill, West Virginia. He also sent William Chapman with another battalion of men farther east in the area of the Point of Rocks to intercept the trains. Mosby had a time schedule. He knew what time the train would be coming by here. During the day of the 13th, he was going to spend a lot of time with his men along the Martinsburg-Winchester Turnpike, or what we call usually the Valley Pike. And they were intercepting riders and couriers during that day, and even killed a few Union soldiers and captured a few civilians. In Martinsburg, the Brigadier General William Seward, the son of the Secretary of State, received reports that Mosby was in the area. One of his soldiers said he recognized Mosby and he had his foot bound up. Seward also telegraphed Brigadier General John Stevenson in Harper's Ferry. That evening, the evening of the 13th, they headed this way. After dark, probably around 11 or 12 o'clock, they reached the woods, left some men behind with the horses, and came over here. Now, Mosby was probably on horseback at the time. They would take position along this bank. Some of the men took out a rail on the outside of the line, so the train would slide right into the bank. However, as I said, it would crash. The men, probably by midnight, a little bit after, they knew the train was coming along. The men went to sleep. Mosby even said he put his head in one of his men's lap and dozed off.
Some of the boys, perhaps most of them, soon fell asleep, but tired nature's sweet restorer was not for me that night. The lights and sounds from a neighboring camp first interested me, and then my imagination ran riot. Anticipations of what was certain to happen, and pictures of what might happen in the next half hour set my nerves tingling. It is not a pleasant thing to lie calmly under the stars and contemplate the usual contingencies of a straight fight, but the possible horrors of a railroad wreck, and the sufferings of women and children, and not improbably the presence of a carload of infantry, took such tangible shapes in my meditations as to give me a very bad half hour. Presently, I heard the train coming, and I hurried around, waking up the boys, and then I went back to my place and watched and listened to the thumping of my heart. Nearer and louder came the sounds, and quicker beat my pulses. Directly, the headlight of the engine shot around a curve not far off, and as the engine rushed almost under me, it seemed that my heart well nigh choked me. And then there was a tremendous thump and the shriek of the steam and the sound of a single shot, and then the deluge.
I was aroused and astounded by an explosion and a crash. The catastrophe came so suddenly that my men at first seemed to be stunned and bewildered. A good description of the scene can be found in Dante's Inferno. Because as we had displaced the rail, the engine had run off the track, the boiler burst, and the air was filled with red-hot cinders and escaping steam. Above all, could be heard the screams of the passengers, especially the women.
"Board her, boys!" rang out the colonel's crisp, steady tones. That brought me back to sense and braced me. The conductor of the train seemed to take in the situation more promptly than any of us, and never for a moment lost his nerve. He jumped off between his train and us, swinging a lighted lantern, and cried out that he surrendered the train. Down the bank we rushed.
John Alexander, who's a young man that later wrote a book about his experience with Mosby, said he couldn't sleep because he was just visualizing crashing a train. He knew passengers were going to be on the board, and it could cause a large loss of life. As I said before, the train's coming this way. Alexander describes it as it makes the curve and comes into view. When it got here, it just thundered past, and all of a sudden there was a crash. The men started falling out of the steam almost like apparitions and boarding the train.
As I ran up the steps on the platform of a coach, a tall ranger was standing with his pistol, poked through the door ajar, calling on somebody to surrender. Being short and slim, I slipped under his arm and jumped in. On the first seat sat a soldier with a lady beside him, who, as I stopped, assured me that her husband was a sick man. Just behind them sat a gentleman, across whose portliness stretched a gold watch chain. He must have noticed that it fascinated my gaze, for he promptly presented it to me without detaching from it a beautiful gold watch. Of course, I could not accept such munificence without some inquiry into the condition of his finances. The generous man responded to this with an offer of his pocketbook, but I had barely noticed its plump appearance when a long, lank arm reached over my shoulder and appropriated what my modesty might have declined. And by this time the boys were crowding into the car.
Charlie Deere, one of the Ranger Scouts, went with Jim Wiltshire, went into one of the cars. Wiltshire went into one, Deere another. Deere shot a Union soldier who got up. And once again, it was complete bedlam as the Rangers not only are looking for payroll, there was a safe on board with $20,000 in it, Adams Express. The whole train consisted of 5 passenger cars, sleeper, a baggage car, and an Adams Express car, a little bit like a UPS service that would transport money. And even that night, transporting one dead body, a soldier, back home. A lot of confusion. The men hurtling on the train tried to give their valuables to women because the Confederates would seldom bother or steal from women. 12-year-old Sally Martin, she'd been with her uncle and aunt to Baltimore that day, and as soon as Confederates got on board, her uncle handed her his expensive timepiece, and she was able to save it even though she was twirling around on her finger. The Confederate didn't see it.
2 of my men, Charlie Deere and West Aldridge, came to me and reported that they had 2 U.S. paymasters with the satchels of greenbacks.
Deere and another ranger went back to check on some of the Union soldiers, and they discovered a satchel and a box. They took it outside and found that it was money. It was filled with uncut greenbacks, or paper money. And this money was to pay the troops in Martinsburg and other Sheridan's troops. So this was a big haul. They take it out, show it to Mosby. Now remember, these people were partisan rangers. Partisan rangers could keep anything that they captured, and if it was arms or equipment or horses, sell it back to the Confederate government or keep it for themselves. So Mosby knew this was a good payday for the troops. His 84 men, he picked 4 men out, including Deere and Lieutenant Grogan, and he sent them back across the Blue Ridge with that money to a place called Bloomfield.
Mosby, who was using a cane after his recent injury, and as he supervised the plundering from a hillside, maintained that he wasn't following closely the possible taking of personal valuables from the passengers. He later wrote of the raid, "Whether my men got anything in the shape of pocketbooks, watches, or other valuable articles, I never inquired, and I was too busy attending to the destroying of the train to see whether they did."
The men, especially in the sleeper car, lost almost everything because they didn't have time to hide their valuables. Some of the men who were in the cars were taken out into the woods. First, they thought that they were going to be maybe even shot, but the Rangers took them out there, made them strip completely, and then they took what they wanted from them. Valuables, sometimes they took their pants and so on. And even after this was all over, these men, rather than getting back on the train in front of the women without much of their clothes, decided they'd walk on to Carneysville. While all this was going on, Mosby is standing on the back bank. Women are coming up, asking him for favors. One said, "My father's a mason," trying to get some help from Mosby in that way. And Mosby told him, "Well, I don't care. You have to get out of here." On board the train, women especially were asking for protection. But I want to emphasize, no women were hurt during this time. I believe Alexander said, he told a few of the women on the train there that they didn't have to worry. They were Southern gentlemen, and they had the most beautiful women in the South, and these women on the train didn't have to worry. So this is complete bedlam. It's going to last for about 45 minutes.
It did not take long to pull out the passengers. While all this was going on, I stood on the bank giving directions to the men, and one of them reported to me that a car was filled with Germans. They would not get out. And I told him, "Set fire to the car and burn the Dutch if they won't come out." There was a lot of New York Heralds on the train for Sheridan's army, so my men circulated the papers through the train and applied matches. Cabmatics came dashing up and cried out that the Yankees were coming. I immediately gave orders to mount quickly and form, and one was sent to find out if the report was true. He soon came back and said it was not. The men then dismounted and went to work again, and I was very mad with Cab for almost creating a stampede, and told him that I had a good mind to have him shot. And Cab was quick-witted, but seeing how angry I was, said nothing then. And years afterward, Cab confessed why he gave the false alarm. He said he heard the noise the train made when it ran off the track and knew the men were gathering the spoils and did not think it was fair for him to be away picketing for their benefit. Suddenly there was a grand illumination. The Germans now took in the situation and came tumbling all in a pile out of the flames. They ought not to blame me, but Sheridan. It was his business, not mine, to protect them.
Sally Martin, about this time, is getting off the train, but she's having a problem. She bought a big hat, a big beaver hat that day for herself, and also 2 drums. And she's trying to get off the train. She can't do it. One of Mosby's men comes to her and says, "Sis, I'll help you." And he takes her over here on the bank, and he tells her, "I know it's cold, but it's going to be warm pretty soon."
We left all the civilians, including the ladies, to keep warm by the burning cars.
Now, there are 27 soldiers on board, and some of these are going to be taken captive, including the 2 paymasters on board, Major Ruggles and Major Moore. They are lined up, and one of the soldiers says to his sergeant, "I'm afraid they're going to shoot us." And he said, "Don't worry, they haven't gone that far yet." Now, remember, a month before in Centralia, Missouri, Bill Anderson, Jesse James, and others got over 20 soldiers off of a train there at the station and shot and killed all but one. So that's what this soldier was thinking about, and they were going to be in that type of situation.
The soldiers were taken with us as prisoners. Among the latter was a young German lieutenant who had just received a commission and was on his way to join his regiment in Sheridan's army. He was dressed in a fine beaver cloth overcoat, high boots, and a new hat with gilt cord and tassel. After we were pretty well acquainted, I said to him, "We have done you no harm. Why did you come over here to fight us?" "Oh," he said, "I only come to learn the art of war." I then left him and rode to the head of the column. It was not long before the German came trotting up to join me. There had been such a metamorphosis that I scarcely recognized him. One of my men had exchanged his old clothes with him for his new ones, and he complained about it. I asked him if he had not told me that he came to Virginia to learn the art of war. "Yes," he replied. "Very well," I said. "This is your first lesson."
And they disappear into the night. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But back to the passengers. Here are the passengers. It's very cold, but the fire has started. Pretty soon, the whole train is going to be consumed, including the money on board, the $20,000 that was headed to a bank in Cumberland. Suddenly, they hear all this pop, 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 and soon the smell of oysters. The next morning, a train comes from Martinsburg and picks the passengers up. Back to Mosby, they're headed east across the Blue Ridge. By this time, Union General Stevenson in Harper's Ferry has sent out men to capture him, and also General Stewart, but he's able to escape.
My men had an easy time capturing the train, and although they were not indifferent to greenbacks, their mettle was up when they heard that old Blaze was about. They were eager for a fight in which they could win more laurels. It was not long before we struck Blaze's trail and saw his campfires where he had spent the night. I could no longer restrain the men. They rushed into the camp as reapers descend to the harvests of death. We crossed the Shenandoah and Blue Ridge before noon and found Grogan's party with the Greenbacks waiting for us at the appointed place in Loudoun County. The men were ordered to dismount and fall in line, and 3 were appointed, Charlie Hall, Mountjoy, and Fount Beatty, to open the satchels and count the money in their presence. I ordered it to be divided equally among them, and no distinction be made between officers and men. Of course, the motive of the act was to stimulate enterprise.
They will reach Bloomfield, and there Mosby will set up a division of the money. Okay? Each man will get a little bit over $2,000 in greenbacks. A big haul. You could say that today, that might equate to $60,000 to $80,000 in purchasing power.
James Thomas Littleton, whose family lived at the Snow Hill farm about 3 miles away, got family help in making his $2,000 share of paper money look less new. Ada Littleton Tavener, who was a little girl in 1864, recounted how her brother, Jimmy Littleton, was with Mosby when the payroll train was robbed. All the girls, her parents, and Jimmy went down into the dirt cellar at night with lanterns, and there for several hours crimped and shuffled the new money and rubbed it with dirt and grime to make it appear old and used.
Mosby, however, refuses to take 1 cent. He was a great student of ancient history. And he always told the men and other people he fought for glory, not for spoils. Just like the Achilles and people like that back in the days of ancient Greece and Rome.
Alexander later recalled of the incident, "No sort of solicitations from his men could induce him to take a share. His emphatic response was that he was fighting for glory, not for spoils. I've always wondered what he took us for. But so sensitive on this point was he that he would not even permit Mrs. Mosby to accept a purse of gold, which the boys subsequently made up and tendered her."
So he doesn't take any money, yet later those men will take up a collection and they will purchase a horse, but they'll give it to his wife. And then she will give it to him, and that way he will take it.
On Monday, December 22, 1902, in Brooklyn, New York, a news article was reported across the nation, including the Kansas City Star in Missouri. It read, "He was Mosby's bodyguard. The death of nonagenarian Negro Aaron Burton in Brooklyn. The funeral of Aaron Burton, the Negro bodyguard of Colonel John S. Mosby, the Confederate cavalry leader, was conducted yesterday at the home of his daughter. Burton, who was more than 90 years old, lived in Brooklyn for 7 years. He was born in Charlottesville, Virginia, and belonged to Miss Jenny McGarren, who became the wife of Colonel Mosby. In the Civil War, Colonel Mosby placed the utmost confidence in his bodyguard and frequently sent him on important missions. In later life, the colored man was not forgotten by his old master, who frequently sent him checks. After the war, always guided by logic with lawyerly precision and independence, Mosby sought out the company of Sam Chapman, to whom he wrote his thoughts, and visited like-minded old warriors such as William Edward Hitchcock MacDonald at Media Farm near Charlestown, West Virginia. In a letter to Sam Chapman, June 1907, "I wrote you about my disgust at reading the reunion speeches. It has since been increased by reading Christian's report. I am certainly glad I wasn't there. According to Christian, the Virginia people were the abolitionists, and the Northern people were pro-slavery. He always says slavery was a patriarchal institution, and so were polygamy and circumcision. Ask Q if he has been circumcised. Christian quotes what the old Virginians said against slavery. True, but why didn't he quote what the modern Virginians said in favor of it? Mason, Hunter, Wise, etc. Why didn't he state that a Virginia Senator Mason was the author of the Fugitive Slave Law? And why didn't he quote the Virginia Code that made it a crime to speak against slavery? Now, while I think as badly of slavery as Horace Greeley did, I am not ashamed that my family were slaveholders. It was our inheritance. The South went to war on account of slavery. South Carolina went to war, as she said in her secession proclamation, because slavery would not be secure under Lincoln. South Carolina ought to know what was the cause for her seceding. The truth is, the modern Virginians departed from the teachings of the fathers. I am not ashamed of having fought on the side of slavery. A soldier fights for his country, right or wrong. He is not responsible for the political merits of the course he fights in. The South was my country. The aging Mosby visits another old war veteran, William Edward Hitchcock MacDonald, and his granddaughter Julia remembered the visits. She also remembered some profound guidance her grandfather gave her about why he fought for his people in the Civil War. But with a twist. Julia Davis recalled in an interview with Jim Surkamp in 1990.
Grandfather, I learned to make a mint julep when I was about 6. With my Aunt Mary would go and make them. Some of his Confederate colleagues would come by to visit him, like Mosby, and they would sit on the front porch and reminisce, and we would serve them a couple of mint juleps each. But I just remember 2 old men talking and laughing together. They just sat on the front porch in comfortable rocking chairs and reminisced. We always served them juleps. You know, with company, yes, you'd have juleps, so especially if it was an old Confederate. I mean, that was obviously the thing. Grandfather was one of the leaders. I remember Mosby very distinctly because he was always greeted with particular enthusiasm. When I was about 11, which was shortly before he died, he had fought from 1st Manassas to Appomattox. I didn't quite finish telling you what Grandfather said about the war. He said he'd have to fight the way he did. After all, Virginia had been here for 150 years before there was and the states were very conscious of their own governments still. He didn't approve of slavery and said he would never own a slave, and he also didn't approve of secession. And then he told me he would have to fight the way he did because he couldn't have fought his own people. But, he said, you must always be very glad we didn't win. So he took the whole thing off the top of my head there. When I went away to boarding school, I never had to be a Southerner, you know. He was a very intelligent man.